Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome and thank you for coming to my talk, Adapting a Complex Game Design into Coherence Using UX and UI. Today, I'm going to take you through a few techniques I use to adapt game design concepts into something more players can understand and play, through the lens of my time working on the remake of the cult classic Solium Infernum. As a side note, I'm not going to generally get into core skills around UX and UI, such as graphic design principles, laws of UX, and things like that. So there's plenty of resources out there already around those. First things first, though. Who am I anyway? My name's Alex Miles, and I'm a senior UI UX designer and game designer. I've worked on many games in the Australian game scene over the last 15 years, and hopefully some of you have already seen or experienced some of my work. A few of the titles I've contributed to are on the right here. The content of this talk covers some of my time working at League of Geeks here in Melbourne. But before I get into my talk, I'd like to shout out a few people who greatly contributed to shaping the UI and UX of Solium Infernum. Ty Carey, Dave Collinson, Natasha Shelby, Jairus Rayner, Anthony Sweet, William Dice, and Hamish Downs, and our fantastic publishing and community team. I hope I didn't forget anyone. Everyone on the team truly make this game it is what it is. And with that, let's get into it. Part 1, A Diamond in the Dark. First off, a bit of background. The original Solium Infernum was released in 2009 by solo developer Vic Davis under his company Cryptic Comet. It's a deep multiplayer strategy game. The premise of the game is the Dark Lord of Hell has gone missing, and you, as the players, take control of the remaining archfiends, all vying to take his place upon the now empty infernal throne. It's a game of many systems and rules. It was a relatively small game, and it didn't gain much mainstream attention. But over the years, gathered somewhat of a cult classic status for its unique and unconventional gameplay. It was ranked number 15 best strategy game of all time by Rock Paper Shotgun. And of note, it was made entirely in a program called Adobe Director, long after it wasn't really being used anymore. If you're too young to know what that is, it was kind of an offshoot of Flash, but it was generally used to create relatively crude multimedia applications. One reason you didn't hear about it, probably, is the game is unconventional, clunky, and very hard to learn. It has notoriously confusing UI, partially due to the fact it was made in Director. It felt dated back even in 2009. It's extremely complicated, full of interlocking rules and mechanics. Many are not explained in the game client at all. It also has no tutorial of any kind. Its 50-page PDF manual is basically required reading if you were to have any hope of grasping what's going on. So I'd like to share a quote of the review of the game by Tom Chick. So rich in detail, so full of interlocking systems and interdependent numbers, but the relationships among them are a casualty of the interface. Pieces of important information are scattered far and wide, often a few screens removed from where they relate to each other, often chopped and diced and relegated to too stingy plots of too small screen real estate. So this is the original Solium Infernum. As you can see, it's kind of a strange looking game. This is the main view where players look over the stark plains of hell. They make their plans, and they move around. And this is an example of one of the many UI views in the game. Most of the game's actions and information is taken through pop-up windows like these. They all look fairly similar. Relevant information isn't close at hand for players when they need it. It lacks basic genre conventions like tooltips and a help system. And here's an example of what the UI makes even more confusing than necessary. You can open menus when you might not even be able to perform that action yet, and it just opens an empty window with no explanation of why or what the screen does or why it's empty. The game is full of little things like this that make a very complicated game even more obtuse. So as you can see, there was plenty of room for improvement. So jump to 2021, 12 years later. Ty Carey, one of the Log founders, had been a huge fan of the original game and a long-time friend with Vic, the original game's creator, and eventually acquired the rights from him to remake the game. So we put together a pitch and we got the green light. The plan was to reimagine the game and grow the audience. How? Make it easy to comprehend and play. We would adapt the game, keeping the core of it largely the same, but maintaining all the deep strategy that made the original so compelling. But modernise it and remove all the unnecessary friction from the experience, so more people could play and enjoy it. So part 2, adapting a cult classic. So getting started. What could we do? What could we learn from the original? Playtest. We started our journey as a team, all learning about the game and playing it together. We were lucky enough to be able to reference the original. It was invaluable because we could see all the things it was doing well and all the things it wasn't. In a more traditional game development pipeline, where you don't have an existing game to work off, this is probably where you'd build prototypes. And we actually did do some of that, but having the original as a reference point was an extremely good time saver. So, we learnt the esoteric rules of the game together. We wrote documents detailing our experiences and things we discovered. I asked the team to write up feedback of what they found lacking or hard to comprehend. We also scoured the internet for any feedback that existing players had mentioned since its release. We then grouped and adapted that feedback into player-focused user stories. These user stories are invaluable in shaping the game moving forward, and they would require all disciplines to solve, not just UI design. Throughout development, we repeated this kind of process by running playtests on our version of the game and gathering data from surveys given out to testers. We then employed the same techniques, grouping similar feedback together, and from that, creating new user problems for us to solve. And here's an example of some of the initial user stories that I wrote up and some of the summarized feedback points that contributed to that story. The number of the crosses next to the story reflects how often the feedback was mentioned, and this was helpful in prioritizing which issues were most prevalent. We used this kind of technique later on with something a bit more sophisticated with a Miro board, but we didn't even have Miro at this time. So we created the UI structure of the game with this data in mind, checking against the user stories to see if we could make improvements. This helped us stay on the right track. I kept it high level for now to avoid getting stuck in the tendrils of design. This is important with complicated games. It's tempting to want to dig deep and make working systems, but you've got to have a solid foundation to build on first. I'm sure we all know UA flow can be really expensive to unpick when it's not working. The best way I found to do this is just start with lists of sections. Don't even think about exact screen layout. Just map out groups of things that can go where and see if they make sense. Then get rounds of feedback and iterate according to any new feedback you receive. Make sure you test with people familiar and unfamiliar with the game. And this is what that looks like. As you can see, I'm not really doing anything specific with layout, and I'm keeping it extremely loose. Just seeing where information could live and under what hierarchy it could make sense. I denoted top-level elements here with a red outline. And after that, I moved on to a bit more explicit wireframing, using one of our early concept arts to help inject some context. I'm still mapping out sections here, but I'm now assigning them areas of the screen and checking which placements make the most sense. We prototyped a lot on what would end up as our base structure. And this is just a wireframe from the game, just from the same screen, just later on. The main view is something that had lots of small iterations over the course of its development, and as mechanics and systems were changed. So, to summarize, staying player-focused helped us shape the framework of the game, and it kept us aligned on why we were solving problems. It's important to keep asking questions about your own designs and whether they're still serving the game and your players, and encourage your team to do the same. It's easy to lose sight of our problems. User stories don't just expire because you solved them once. As a game, as you build a game, plenty of things can change that may affect the user's perception. So keep assessing. Part 3, the devil's in the details. So we tested and felt out the overall structure. Things were working relatively well. It was time for features. The challenge, the game has large interlocking systems with a lot of design complexity. Building dedicated elements for everything was just impossible. And to add to that, we had a small UI UX design team. For the majority of the project, I was the only UI UX resource on the game. And for some of that, I was spread across 2 titles. We needed a lot of UI, whichever way you looked at it. So I had to make sure I could get the most out of things by reusing as much as possible. So these are my top 3 most valuable takeaways from working on Solium Infernum. 1, utilize common mechanics to shape your designs. 2, provide users with context where it's lacking. And 3, remember, UX is not just UI. I'll get into more detail on these points now. Number 1, utilize common mechanics. Identify and utilize common mechanics to build design elements that can be used across your game. I describe a common mechanic as a mechanic that crops up across more than one system in the game. For example, in Solium, we have the Bazaar and the Ritual system, which both require players to spend currency. Cost and spending are both common mechanics here. Common mechanics are important because you can start to understand all the pieces that make up your game and what kind of UIs you'll need to generate. Run workshops with your design team to assess and flag requirements to ensure you can support the types of information displays required. In Solium Infernum, we reviewed mechanics and brainstormed which ways to convey that information, looking for opportunities to visually simplify things or convey them better. Because of the sheer number of actions in the game, we also created big Excel spreadsheets full of this information, which was just essential reference in building the UI. So this is a breakdown of a tooltip that appears when you hover a ritual in the game. It's basically a lot of nested design widgets that I've listed to the right. These widgets can be used in other designs where the same kind of information is needed. Targets, conditions, costs, and of course input crop up everywhere in the game. And this is an example of one of my wireframes for all the states of this tooltip. It's important to consider all the states a design can be in and be as thorough as possible when designing something like this to make sure it can cover all bases. I like to make sure a design is comprehensible even at this stage, so I write placeholder text at the very least communicates the concept clearly. While someone will go over this text later and give it another pass, I think at a baseline it should communicate what it needs to in order to properly validate the design. Also, keep track of these designs and communicate them to the wider team. If the rest of the team doesn't know about a design they could create something that does exactly the same thing later on. I'm sure we've all been on games where there's 10 or so of the exact same button prefab. That's exactly why conveying the design exists is as important as creating it. This is where things like a guide document the entire team can access can be a good idea. Also note this reference isn't for other designers. It can be used to communicate function to others as well. I created a style guide in Solium just for our engineers to reference, and even though it wasn't up to date all the time, it was an invaluable resource in communicating the rules of the UI. Another example of leveraging common mechanics are our unit cards. You'll see they all share these ability widgets at the bottom there with a little icon, which is how we showed the many special attributes a unit could have in a consistent way, something that wasn't present at all in the original. We iterated on these cards a lot over the course of development, and even though they look simple, it was a real challenge creating the visual language and getting all the information on them. I made sure the art area stayed really nice and large, as it was a key part of the fantasy of the game, and it was easy for it to be overwhelmed with information. Number 2, provide context where it's lacking. Now this might seem like an obvious one, but it's the number one I see when a design fails in testing. It's usually because the context for the action hasn't been explained properly. This is especially common when design patterns are lifted from other places without considering the context setting around them. If looking for inspiration elsewhere, it's important to know why something works before you adapt it to your own game. So, if a concept's hard to relate to or understand, try to put it in terms your player will more easily understand. There are many ways to provide context for player actions. Consider what your players may know and may not know at this point in their journey, and the flow surrounding the experience. So I'm going to go over an example of how we injected a bit more context setting into a UI in Solium, which was the ritual system. It's a system where you cast dark magic on yourself and enemies. And as your power grows throughout the game, you can eventually frame other players for your dark deeds. And this is how it looked in the original Solium Infernum. It's basically these boxes on the right that you slot rituals into. In the case of this UI, it's set up a little context for a player with a little ritual circle in the background, but it's so light on its style, you can't really tell what's going on here just by looking at it. You can't see what rituals you have, and there's also the framing mechanic that's entirely hidden at the top level. It's just invisible to a player if they don't have the ability, and even if they do, they won't know until they try and cast a ritual. So here are some goals for our version. Make players understand the mechanics more easily by providing more information. Make players feel badass when casting rituals. And make aspirational so players form goals around growing in power. So this was the wireframe where we got to with the design before implementing it into the game. Even at this stage, most of the thinking around the theming was done. It was just the bare minimum level of art to communicate the message. What we wanted to do is take this theming and dial it up to 11 in the art pass to help provide more context and fantasy for people. We added ritual cards so players know what they can cast, and we added the tooltips, which you saw from earlier, when a player hovers those cards, to give them information about what a particular ritual does before they cast it. We also added missing feedback, like your ritual power and resistance, and a spot for the framing mechanic in the upper right. And I'll dive a bit deeper into what we did to make that set more context for that framing mechanic. So our problem is, how do we expose the ritual framing mechanic, make it fit into our game world, and make it aspirational too? And the solution, a masking mirror. A demonic a dark mirror that when you reach a certain power level, it reflects who the other players will see when you cast a ritual. This was just something I thought of when making the wireframe to make it help and make sense for a player. By attaching it to a familiar concept that the player will know, like a mirror, you get a lot of understanding for free. It initially just started as a written description and a grey circle in the wireframe. So I pitched the idea to the team, and we all liked it. So it eventually became this. This fantastic art pass was done by Dave Collinson. This is the power of thinking about and setting context for UI elements. What was just a mechanic that existed in plain text in a pop-up that was hidden away was now something that players could covet. And here it is in context of our final ritual screen. Like most of the screens in the game, it was a big collaboration from the whole team. Which brings me to my last takeaway. Number 3, UX is not just UI. UX and UI designers' roles and artist roles are often miscategorized and misunderstood. We are regularly placed under the art discipline only, when more often than not, our roles have more to do with design than art. Art is important, but making pretty is just one aspect of our possible skill set. Good user experience encompasses all aspects of a game. UX and design principles apply to more than you'd expect, not just UI elements. Did you consider Gestalt principles apply to things like enemy encounter design, for example? There's another talk, Bridging the Gap Between UX Principles and Game Design by Jim Brown from Epic, that discusses this in more detail. And there's a link to this talk on the right. So, we're champions of the player in the game design, but we need trust from our team to make that happen. So build a synergistic relationship with your entire team to solve player problems together. Building a culture of trust and problem solving as a team makes this whole process easier. I want to especially encourage game designers and UI UX designers to work collaboratively, discuss and form solutions as a team rather than just handing off work to each other. Consider different disciplines tend to speak different languages, so try and communicate them with them on their level. Raving about the laws of UX to someone less experienced design-minded may not result in what you expect. Ultimately, it's our job to convey the game we're making to players, so the better communication we have internally, the better it'll be externally. So, I'm going to go over an example about thinking about a sequence as a whole benefited its UX, which is the post-game sequence. Basically, this is what happens at the end of a game when a winner is announced to other players. There's 3 possible ways to win the game, but for this example, I'm going to focus on the manipulation victory. The manipulation victory in Solium is a specific type of condition where one player specifies another unknowingly as their puppet. If their puppet wins the game, the puppet is backstabbed at the last minute and the manipulator really wins the game. So here's how the in-game sequence looked in the original Solium. It had this nice bit of art, and then it just showed this list of players with the winner on the top. It wasn't very well structured, and it was kind of confusing to who even won. When I first played my first game of Solium Infernum, I had no idea what happened. So some goals for our version. Make players feel a sense of anticipation and reward, be more easily understandable, and for manipulation, contain a rug pull moment which people will be genuinely shocked by. A real yell at your monitor kind of moment, both good and bad. First, I broke down the post-game into key moments, focusing on how I wanted players to feel. Then, I began to fill out details of how the dedicated sequences would play out. I figured later on we would get storyboards and dedicated art done and would have a whole little animated sequence. Something like demons all assembling, the winner coming forward and sitting upon the throne, and then the real winner stabs him in the back and emerges triumphantly. It was very literal. The core of it, though, is that I wanted the endgame sequence to play out exactly the same way as it would as if there was no manipulation and it was a normal victory. Until it's revealed, it isn't. So players would be blindsided by it. Basically, kind of like the end of Mario Party, but more strategic. But time was tight, and it turned out we didn't have the capacity to do animation and all the art that it would require. So, I went back and I thought about the original intention of the screen and what I could come up with in a cheaper manner, but still craft a similar experience for the player. I made some flow and mock-ups using existing art we'd already made for other things, but repurposed it, adding some text to set the scene before revealing the winner of the game in our existing throne room. So there's a video that follows. I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm going to try and show you a pre-visualization of this sequence that I made before it got into the game. It differs a bit from this in the final game, but getting the capture was really difficult. So to set the scene, you have to imagine you've played a really very long strategy game, and it seems Astaroth, who's way in front of you, is going to capture the throne, and then this endgame sequence plays. So it seemed to work fine, but I wouldn't really know how it went until it got into the hands of players. But we ran a playtest later on, and someone in a blog wrote about this exact moment, and it totally validated everything I'd hoped for the sequence. And I'll use their words here. And then the election finished, and the game announced that Murmur was the victor. And before I could express mild disdain, yeah, fuck yeah. I wish I could have seen Murmur's face when a cutscene played explaining that I fucking got him. I felt like the coolest motherfucker on the planet. This is the value of leveraging everything you can think of to create a user experience. So, everything on the screen can help convey understanding of a concept. Tell a story and think about how you want the player to feel. As a starting point, just use words on an empty canvas to explain what the user will experience step by step. For this, I originally split it into moments focusing how I wanted a player to feel, and then a lot of the sequences in Solium were designed this way in the beginning. What else can you leverage to communicate the concept to a player? Consider the rest of your team and what they can bring to that. Art, animation, design, words, audio, all tools you can use to tell the player a story. So provide some context and solve player problems together. Part 4, give the devil his due. So 2.5 years later, we'd remade a game. And just as a little reminder, this is where we started from. And this is what we ended up with. And here's what replaced some of those pop-up windows we saw earlier. We have full screen modals for everything, and we really tried to draw the fantasy of the game and, yeah, make people feel enveloped in the world. But have we succeeded? Well, some good news and some bad news. So the game reviewed beyond all expectations. While I was concerned the complexity of the experience was still possibly too hard for players, people embraced it. We even snuck into the top 100 PC games of all time on OpenCritic for a moment there. We eventually settled at 120. And so here's some player validation quotes from reviews of some of our players after the game's release. Devilishly simple to learn, yet diabolically difficult to master. Enter Gehenna and suffer in earnest. Absolute monstrosity of a game. So many things happening, but each piece is so simple to grasp. And it's an odd feeling when one of your favourite games ever gets a remake which improves it in practically every conceivable way. But okay, time for the bad news. Unfortunately, the game wasn't enough to sustain our studio in the current climate. And unfortunately, there's similar stories like these all throughout our industry. I don't have the answers or know what's going to happen next, but I hope I get to work with a talented team again on unique creative games sometime soon. So why it was worth it is we succeeded on what we set out to do. We'd reimagined Solium Infernum and we'd solved all our high-level problems. We created a critically acclaimed and truly unique game, one that has many passionate players that keep playing after hundreds of hours of playtime, and I'm proud I got to be a part of that. And trust in team culture matters. Game development is meant to be like this. We had a clear direction for the game from the beginning, and although it was challenging to adapt, like any game is difficult to make, our team was highly functional. We were always moving forward throughout development, and we rarely created any wasted work. It was probably the best creating something this complicated could go. And Solium Infernum lives on. I have no doubt in years, players will keep coming and discovering our little weird game that we made. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, then yep.
Yeah, was there any UI or such that when you were like, oh, this makes total sense to me, this should be totally easy to understand, and then you gave it to someone else and they went, I don't know what I'm looking at, and how did you sort of handle getting that?
I don't think I've ever had that experience of just like no one knows what I'm looking at, but I think there was a lot of iteration, and we made a lot of different. I'd always make a lot of different options when I made UIs. So I'd always talk through them with the design team. So I think that assisted us in that regard. There was nothing that was just like unintelligible, I don't think. Anyone else?
Yeah, you spoke about how a lot of sort of complex sort of designs were difficult to sort of understand in the original game, and the information was very hidden away and disconnected. When sort of remaking it, did you have to sort of prioritize what was most important? But then did you have secondary information you kind of had to hide, and how did you kind of solve that?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that solved a lot of problems in context injection for the game was like tooltips as a system. Like the original didn't have that, and we had a lot of things where it's like, well, we can just put this here and then not. Like the original would write everything out, so it would have a paragraph of text, basically for every little thing. But we could just put, well, this box is going to, when you hover it, it's going to tell you what it does. So that solved a lot of our problems in that regard. Yeah. Are you there?
Were there any examples from the original game that you discovered actually did work well or better than you thought that you brought forwards into the new version?
There were definitely things that worked okay, and things that did work quite fine. Some of the movement things worked okay, but I think I'm just trying to think. I'll come back to that. Sorry, I completely blanked. Sorry.
Have you ever give up any features from the original game just to simplify it?
We tried to simplify mechanics in the original game as much as possible. There are a few things that we removed. I think the leveling system, for example, had like a two-tiered leveling system where you would level one power and it would level another power that was almost the same thing. So we just streamlined it into being just one thing. There are a few other examples of stuff we streamlined, but I can't think of them right now.
How do you decide which one to give up first?
Mainly if it just, I mean, it depends. We didn't want to ever impact the core complexity of the game and anything that was like interestingly complex, but if it just wasn't, if it was just complicated for the sake of being complicated, I think those are the things that we thought put on the chopping block. Are you there?
When you're like designing UI UX, do you have to like different languages or localizations? Like, have
Yep.
you changed anything?
Yeah, it definitely does. You have to make sure that you have enough buffer and placement around every item in the game, and most UIs we have to make sure that they're going to be dynamic and grow dynamically if text doesn't fit. It can vary wildly with UI, especially if we're translating into different languages like Russian and things like that. I think we have a Russian SKU for Solium.
You test it as you go?
Yeah, we test it as we go, and we just see if things fit. It's mainly the last thing you're doing on a game is fixing the little localization problems. Are you over there?
Did you have to deal with right to left text support as well?
No Arabic on this game, unfortunately. Thankfully. Yep.
I know this is a game set in hell, and you had to have some parts of the UI lie to the player to be untrustworthy. Some of those challenges.
Yeah, so it was a challenge. A lot of the end-game sequence, in the original game, the end-game sequence wasn't shown at all. So if you pressed end turn in the original game, it just told you in text what happened. And in our version, we had to actually visualize that all to the player. So we had to figure out how we were even going to show all those kind of things. And that created a lot of problems around how we were going to do that. So it was just a long process of going through flows and trying to say the right thing essentially. Sorry. Ethan.
One of the challenges that I have where I currently work is testing user interface. It tends to take us days to go through all the various ways to do it. How do you go about testing after you validate it? What shortcuts do you do to avoid having to spend weeks and weeks in testing?
I don't think I could speak to that too much because I wasn't part of the QA team. I think that we had macros and things like that would run through, and we had scripts that would run the game basically by itself. That would helpfully test most of the UI views being opened and closed. I think we had one that just opened all the UI views and then closed them all. So that was helpful. Anyone else? All right, thank you very much.